We are going to dive into the PowerPoint, just like we did earlier for the first hour. And then the second hour, we're going to do movement in the class. And then we have a full hour of Q&A at the end of the session. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. And I know there's some questions that I didn't get to from the last time, so I'm going to answer those in the Q&A today. All right, let me move my chat box out of the way. Let's see, did I close it? And then I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I see. Yeah, let me go participants. There we go. Okay. And then share screen. And here we are. Okay, stop. It's kind of out of the way. And let me get this going full screen. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to get this. There we go. Okay. And then present. Okay. So session 3 is called Investigating Somatics, Cueing and Interoception. Let me make sure, let me skip ahead. Trying to get it to show up at the bottom so I can click to the next. There we go. All right. So I always like to ask people, as I mentioned earlier, I take a lot of continuing ed, and when I'm done, I'm like, oh, I'm going to teach all of this next week or on Monday or to my private client. And that's not really how the learning works. It's, learning is progressive. And so I always tell myself, if there's just one thing that I learned that I want to remember and possibly practice or teach next week, what would that be? So what's one thing you learned in the last workshop that you want to remember? And you can type that in the chat box. And I'm going to go over there and look. Okay, stop share. And then attendees. Okay. And then I think I'm in the right spot. I can see panelists and attendees. I'm in the attendees where it says 78, but I don't see comments. Ah, that's because I'm not in the chat box. Here's the chat box. Okay. All right. Okay. Persistent pain does not necessarily correlate to tissue damage. Oh, I'm so glad that's a takeaway. Yes. I think that's a really, really important thing to take away and learn. That was huge for me. Stay away from negative cueing because of the nocebo effect. Yes, 100%. Nocebo effect. How ground-based work of somatics increases proprioception, especially shoulder blades and back body. For sure. Such a good way to help people connect to the parts of themselves they can't see or sometimes feel or touch or reach. How somatics can be beneficial to yoga. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Yeah, avoid cueing, do this to protect that, right? We can still give the same cue. We just don't need to say we're protecting anything because that can cause people to be afraid and then stop moving. The focus on ability as opposed to limitation. Yes, yes, 100%. So movement optimism and really focusing on what our students and our private clients can do and are already doing well, because that's going to make them feel confident to be able to do more. Cool. All right. Let's see. It says I can hear talking in the background at 1:05 p.m. So hopefully that is solved, and that was 2 minutes ago, but let me know if there's anything I need to do. Yes, goal of somatics to practice basic movement in many ways. 100%. Yay. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, importance of movement variability. Start small, progressively load. Yay! Oh, you guys are so smart. Flowing movement allows for a greater connection within the body. Okay, I'm gonna put that chat box back to the side and head back to the PowerPoint. Let's see, share screen. Apologize if you guys are tired of me talking to myself. But who knows, by the 100th time I've done this, I won't be talking to myself for these little bitty pieces. They'll become automatic. All right, so that takes us to the next slide, and I'm gonna go back to present mode. Okay, so objectives for this session. Objective number 1 is understand the role of interoception in somatics. Objective number 2, learn how to foster interoception through cueing. Number 3, understand the difference between somatic cues and aesthetic cues. And number 4 is experience somatic movement with non-judgmental cueing. All right. So what is interoception? And I'm curious, raise your hand if you've heard of this term or you're familiar with it. Let me go back to that little box and I'm gonna look and see. Oh, cool, lots of people raising their hands. Okay, and I'm glad I know that Andy Ford is not 100 people. That's still happening. But I'm gonna forever remember you, Andy. Okay, yes, so good. A lot of you have heard of interoception and are familiar with it. So I have here for a basic definition, interoception is the ability to perceive physical sensations inside the body that relate to internal organ function. And I'll never forget, like the first time I took a class, and I believe it was a Pilates teacher, and she was cueing based on the organs. I think she had recently done some sort of continuing education with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who is actually on Yoga International as part of one of the, I forget the name of it, but Dana or somebody, you can type it in. It's the one that's got Shelley Prosco and Jules. And anyways, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen is another person to look into as far as somatics. And she talks a lot about the organs. And thinking to myself, how am I supposed to sense my kidneys or, you know, my intestines? But interoception is a skill that can be built. So it requires slowing down to sense internal signals from the body and noticing how they relate to what we are experiencing emotionally. And another side note, if you're curious about interoception as it relates to movement, in addition to Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, I've taken a few continuum classes, and continuum is spelled CONTINUUM. And the woman who created it, oh my gosh, I have her book. Now her name is slipping my mind. She passed away, I think about a year or two ago, but another resource to look into as far as this is concerned. So examples of interoception is being able to sense when you're hungry or thirsty, being able to sense your heart rate, and also being able to notice and sense your breath. So you can see how interoception is so closely related to things we learn and do and practice in yoga. So the cultural impact, I'm laughing, but it's not funny, on interoception. So you might think the ability to sense interoceptive signals would be automatic. And at some point in time, it probably was before you were socialized and conditioned out of it. So culturally, we've been trained to ignore these signals, especially I would say as somebody from the United States, where it's all about doing, and being productive, you know, eating on the run, eating on the go, not pausing and having a 2-hour lunch like they do in Spain, or an afternoon nap. So, and it starts with school. It starts with naturally active children being told to sit still. And that is actually changing, I know, in specific places. There's a woman named Julie Starrett, Starrett, and she has a program that's all about getting schools to change their classrooms so that kids are not forced to sit in desks and chairs all day. So having like standing up tables and just reorganizing the curriculum so there is more movement happening while the kids are learning. But when I was a kid, that was not the case. Then desk jobs during adulthood, right? Stay at your desk, do your work, don't get up. Eat your lunch at your desk, don't leave and go out to lunch. And then we become unable sometimes to differentiate between whether we're hungry or we're bored, whether we're thirsty or we're bored. And meal times revolve around specific times that are like pre-scheduled within the work schedule or the school schedule or social events, which might not coincide when we're actually hungry. So we learn how to override these signals to fit in. And tuning out the body's signals has been linked to eating disorders, alcoholism, anxiety, and depression. I have a little asterisk because the research reference for that is Jenkinson PM. And actually this is again from one of the chapters in my book that's coming out next month. And it's headed to the printers this week. And interventions emphasizing interoception, this is the good news, have been linked with improved emotional well-being and the treatment of some of these disorders. So because of this research, interoception is being used to help people who struggle with eating disorders or anxiety, depression, alcoholism. And it is, they're seeing really positive results. Interoception and mindfulness. So improving interoceptive accuracy through mindfulness practices helps individuals redirect their attention towards what they are sensing instead of fixating on negative or anxious thoughts. I'm just raising my hand. Yes, so one of the reasons I practice yoga and teach yoga, practice somatics and teach somatics. And I am not, I did one like silent meditation retreat many years ago, but for me, I like to meditate and practice interoception when I'm moving, even if the movement is really small and slow and subtle. So doing something like somatics or, lying on a foam roller and wiggling around a little bit. And I think this is really important because there's a lot of research about how meditation improves interoception and so many good reasons to do meditation. But I do think there are folks like me who prefer to meditate with a little bit of movement or lying down versus sitting up. So a study, here's another research study, and again, this is from my book, across 3 community clinics in the Pacific Northwest showed that interoceptive training resulted in improvements in self-regulation and mindfulness skills, a reduction in symptoms of depression and addictive feelings, and better health outcomes over time. So, so much research on this about how helpful it is, and so we can teach it. So interoception can be fostered through very specific types of cueing. And that takes me back to, so the previous class and actually all of the movement classes, I wanted to reiterate that the pre-recorded sequences are just all somatics. And I'm cueing in those pre-recorded sequences and videos in a very slow way, taking lots of time to move, mindfully and sense and body scan. But when I teach my regular group class students, because the class is called yoga, it's called Yoga Deconstructed, so they know it's a blend of things. I only do non-yoga things, say for like the first 10 minutes of the class. So that's why these classes, that I'm teaching are not an hour of somatics. They are usually just like the first 10 minutes. And that is a business decision, I think, for everyone that's wise, meaning Don't do the bait and switch and have people show up for your class and they think they're doing yoga and then you teach an hour of somatics. You want to have all these somatics sequences available to you, but you want to sprinkle it in. I mean, unless of course you're going to call the whole class somatics. So just wanted to point that out and make sure that was clear. So examples of interoceptive cues would be, in which knee are you more at home? Do you feel more energetic tingling in your right arm or your left arm? Can you sense your heartbeat when you connect your index fingers and thumb tips together lightly? And somatics can create the space for interoception to occur. There are moments to pause and reflect throughout the sequences. And, you know, I always teach classes differently. So the most previous class, it was very much somatics at the beginning, yoga, somatics at the end. But then the yoga part was related to the somatics in the sense of directions of movement at specific joints that we did. So that was the through line. But say you're teaching a class that's not a flow, that's more hatha yoga. And so say you do 2 poses and then you do a body scan. And then you do another couple of poses and a body scan. So I'm going to try to teach, you know, throughout this weekend, different styles of yoga classes because I want you to be able to teach the style you teach, but incorporate the somatics into it and see how there's lots of options. Okay, so for example, when students are invited to pause and notice their internal experience, it promotes better communication between the free nerve endings in the viscera, meaning your organs, connective tissue, and the insula. And this is from an interview that Nikki Nablevy and I did for my book. So I interviewed Robert Schleip, and I highly recommend checking him out. I did a full weekend continuing education training with him back in 2012. And he is just brilliant. I did another one that was all online and in person. He's a researcher. He used to be a rolfer. He's kind of in that same category as Todd Hargrove, in that he really bridges from the academic to the movement, and is just a phenomenal educator. So this comes from him. So yoga cues are often very aesthetic, and this is not a bad thing. You know, we have these shapes and these asanas, and we're cueing people into these shapes and asanas. So there's an aesthetic element to it. But sometimes what happens is, if you have people who only take yoga and they don't take any other type of movement modality, they think there's a right and a wrong. So a perfect example would be, yeah, you can flip it if I'm talking for too long. But a perfect example would be Navasana, or boat pose. And so in yoga, when we do boat pose, we, at least the way I was taught, cue to anteriorly tilt the pelvis. So you're up on your sits bones and you're in a neutral spine. And that very same shape, or almost the identical shape, in Pilates is called teaser. And in teaser, everything is the same except for you are behind your sits bones, you're in a posterior pelvic tilt and in lumbar flexion. But otherwise, arms are reaching forward, legs are up in the air. So if you only do Pilates, you might think when you go to yoga and they cue Navasana that that's bad or wrong, or vice versa. And so let me go back to the thing so I remember where I am. Share screen. And here. Yeah, so taking into consideration that some of your students might not take things in other movement modalities. There's a hollow body hold in the fitness realm, which is similar. And so they might think there's only one way, and if they don't do it that way, they're gonna hurt themselves or it's bad. So when you introduce somatics and somatic cueing and you start teaching movement and you have people experiment with different ways of doing a similar shape, they begin to learn that there isn't just one way. They become more autonomous, and they have less fear around basic human movement. Let's hit the next button. Yes. Okay. So examples of aesthetic cues. And again, there's nothing wrong with I think both ways of learning are really, really important. So for example, line up the arch of your right foot with the heel of your left foot. We would say that, maybe in a warrior pose. Bring your feet to parallel, perhaps for Tadasana or Utkatasana. It doesn't mean that you'll hurt yourself if your feet are slightly turned out or in. It's just that's the alignment of the pose. Level the hips. Tuck the pelvis under, say if you're doing a back bend. And so just understanding that there's different ways of cueing and reasons for both. So examples of somatic cues. I don't think I have this one listed, but I'm smiling because when I first started taking Feldenkrais classes, my favorite cue was that they would say was, how can you make this lazier? And I love that as a serial overachiever, ambitious person who works way too hard. When the teacher would say, how can you make this easier? How can you make this lazier? How can you make this more efficient? I was like, oh my God, thank you for giving me permission. And so I think it's a really nice epiphany for students to have, because we often correlate movement with the opposite of that. So how can you make this more efficient? What other parts of your body can participate in this movement to make it easier? So oftentimes in somatics, when I first started, they would give the cue, I would do the movement, but I would never have follow through because I was trained in Pilates and strength and conditioning where you isolate. So if they say rock your pelvis, you just rock your pelvis. You don't let that, move your thoracic spine or your head and neck. And so it took me a while to be able to do the other way, the follow through. And now I can do both, and there's reasons for both. So it's a really good learning movement skill to teach to your students. Other examples of cues. What happens when you make the movement smaller? That's a common one. And in yoga and Pilates and high intensity fitness, a lot of times we're always making the movement bigger and harder and faster. So, what happens when you make it smaller? What do you notice? If you slow down your movement, can you notice more of your experience? And a lot of this makes me think of restorative yoga in so many ways, and how interoception is brought to light and enhanced with restorative yoga. And I kind of think of somatics as similar but different, right? It's that same interoception, but with small, slow movement as opposed to being still in a restorative pose. Okay, more cues. What happens when you reach in different directions or at different angles? So this makes me think of, say, thread the needle. And maybe you have your students, we did this yesterday, kind of explore with, instead of just a straight horizontal thread the needle, what happens if you thread the needle diagonally? Downward dog. You could have a whole class around a somatic sequence, and then, the palm slide with the different angles, and then downward dog each time. Sometimes your hands are tilted out or slightly out or parallel. So playing with different angles and directions. How can you make the movement more comfortable, more relaxed, more natural, more expressive? Here's one I like to use, and I'll use it today in the back bending class for things like Cobra. If you always lift high or locust in this movement, what happens if you stay low? How is it different? Okay, somatic cueing and persistent pain. We talked a lot about persistent pain in the last session. And this is going to bring us more into that, especially related to cues. So somatics may also be beneficial for students with persistent pain who often feel guilty or ashamed that they're unable to do what a therapist or a teacher is telling them to do. So again, going back to the example of, say, cobra or a locust pose, and they have an image in their mind of what that prone, it's just prone spinal extension, what that looks like. And then suddenly you're cueing them to barely lift their nose off the floor, like a millimeter or two, and they can do it. And then things wake up and they're able to map maybe some extension in their upper back they were never able to find before because they're not trying for the big shape. So inviting exploration of movement and internal awareness can reduce the sense of judgment or failure because it removes the external pressure to achieve a specific alignment or experience a predetermined sensation of muscle activation or stretch. So I love, like in the last sequence, I said, when we were in crescent lunge, I said, I'm going to bend my back knee and tuck my pelvis under because I want to feel some stretch in my hip flexor. But then somebody might feel like, oh, when I bend my knee and tuck my pelvis under, I don't feel a stretch in my hip flexor. I must be doing it wrong. And it's like, no, not necessarily, right? I never used to feel stretch there because I was so hypermobile and I didn't have any strength. So I was so loosey-goosey. And so by, I'm going to go back. Let's see, share screen. By having folks do movements while still keeping that framework, which is really good and you learn a lot, but also introducing a new framework where you're not trying to feel a specific stretch in a certain place or specific muscle activation. It helps people to relax and feel like I said here, less of a failure. Like they can just move to move. It doesn't have to be do this for this stretch or do this to feel this muscle work. Okay. To the next slide. Somatics may increase a sense of safety for individuals who have trauma. That is slimy. What time it is? Okay, 1:30. And actually, I'm going to pull out my paper version just so I can see how far along we are. I think we're moving pretty smoothly today. That last PowerPoint was the hardest one. And so was the last class. Okay, next page. Yeah, I think we are doing really well. Okay, so somatics and trauma. Somatics may increase a sense of safety for individuals who have trauma because of how the exercises are taught. And I have a resource here. I have the book right over there, and it's, I loved reading this book and I got so much out of it. Many of you have probably maybe studied with David Emerson in person, but the book is called Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga, Reclaiming Your Body. And I talk a lot about this in my book, but in somatics, because the teacher isn't walking around the room, which sometimes makes, it makes it a little more trauma informed, because the teacher is not doing any hands-on adjustments in somatics, it's a little more trauma informed. Because the movements are less about achieving and more just about feeling and having your own experience, that tends to work well for folks who've experienced trauma, which, by the way, is all of us. That's why I recommended that book, Healing Developmental Trauma. Dr. Aileen LaPierre, who is the somatic psychotherapist that I saw for so long, started off with Peter Levine, and Waking the Tiger, in the 90s was all about, dealing with trauma that's like you were in a war, you were in a car accident, you were mugged, which is a specific kind of trauma, but there's also the trauma that we all have. It's called developmental trauma. It's impossible to live a life without it, right? Where you were teased in school, or your mom or dad didn't have time to give you attention when you were upset once. And so making your classes more trauma informed, whether it's just for the run-of-the-mill developmental trauma, or you teach a specific population, say like veterans. Somatics can come in really handy for that population, in my opinion. Okay, back to the slide. Okay, and then next slide. So somatic exercises allow us to experience movement in a way that is slow, gentle, and without judgment. I mean, what a gift, right? So unlike asana, we're not trying to stretch, or we're not trying to make a specific shape. The intention is just simply to increase our awareness of how our body moves through space. There are no hands-on adjustments. So again, helping folks improve their interoception, improve their proprioception to possibly decrease pain and make them feel more confident in their abilities to move. So for example, like in a group fitness class or Pilates class, crunches are often cued with the intention of feeling the abdominals contract. So say the cue is like, inhale to prepare, expand the backside ribs. Exhale as you engage your transverse abdominis and draw your belly to your spine. And then curl up, right? It's very muscle specific. It's very, the intention is to work your abs, as opposed to, which again, there's nothing wrong with it. Shrinking your abdominals is a great thing to do. But if you were to cue that same exact movement, somebody's lying on the floor, hands are cupping their skull, knees are bent, and you want them to do the same exact thing in a somatic way, you would cue something like, oh, notice the weight of your shoulder blades and your rib cage and the back of your head on the floor. Then start to shift your gaze from looking at the ceiling to looking at the wall in front of you, or perhaps down, at your belly as you lift your head up. Did you notice how now there's more weight on your upper back and no weight underneath your head? Okay, come back down. Now do you notice how your weight has shifted back into your head and your shoulder blades? So this is just a transfer of weight from head and upper back to only upper back to head and upper back. And there's nothing even said about the abdominals. Okay, so I basically said this, but for example, as you lift your head, you may be prompted to notice how your ribs or shoulder blades get heavier on the ground. And then as you lie back down, you may be invited to gently press your head into the floor and feel how the bottom of your ribs get lighter on the floor. Okay, so both actions involve the same direction of movement, which is spinal flexion from supine. They both involve lifting and lowering your head off the ground, but they elicit different results. So in the case of a crunch, we might notice like the burning and contraction in our abdominals, like the tensing that we're doing in our neck and our shoulders, depending on if your hands are supporting your head or not, to get yourself up off the ground. And then when performed as a somatic exercise, you might notice that, like, when you're lying in bed and you just sit up, you don't think like, okay, I'm lying in bed, take a breath in, contract my abdominals, lift my head, now lift my shoulder blades, now sit all the way up. You just sit up. So you might notice when it's cued somatically or with somatic cues, there's a decrease in effort and a sense of ease in the upper body. Again, there is no right or wrong with those two options. It's all depending on what you want to teach. Okay, so this takes us to, with somatic exercise, I touched on this a little bit with the trauma. There's no mirrors, there's no demonstrating, there's no cues about a correct way to perform the movement. And this often reduces performance anxiety over creating the right shape or shame over like poor alignment. And again, I actually am a visual learner, so I appreciate mirrors and I appreciate demonstrations, visual demonstrations, but I think it's nice to not always learn in that way or teach in that way because of what's offered in the somatic experience. So with somatic exercises, the goal is to do less, not more, right? And we don't get that kind of languaging very often, if ever, in our lives. Maybe in restorative yoga, I would say, but not very many other places. So this means you're not moving to build muscles, to burn calories. It's not some part of some fitness program. You are experiencing natural human movement, which many of us haven't felt since we were children. A lot of us have not gotten down on the floor and moved around in weird ways or different ways since we were kids. Okay. So for our students who are in pain, somatics can create a feeling of safety in which to explore movement, right? So if I'm at the gym and teaching somebody like a deadlift or a squat, and it's a heavy weight, I'm not going to be like, oh, let's try it this way or let's try it that way. I'm going to give very specific cues to where, it's going to be the most efficient way to lift that load. But with low stakes, slow, gentle movement on the floor, there's room for exploration and variability. So what often happens is these ways of moving disrupt the tension patterns that can manifest from over efforting. And I'm sure you all have that one student or those 10 students that are like, well, if she cued this, I should do more of what she cued. Like if she said, engage your glutes, I'm going to engage my glutes at 150%, every single time. And so maybe those students end up getting locked in that position to where they're squeezing their glutes when they're doing the dishes and they don't need to, right? Because it just becomes a habit or a pattern. And so oftentimes somatics can help people get out of those over-efforting patterns and remind us of how movement can be pleasurable instead of painful. Okay, so reflection on aesthetic versus somatic cueing. As yoga teachers, many of us have been taught to cue and practice movement from a place of alignment and aesthetics. So as a result, it might be challenging to cue from a place of inquiry. I know it was for me. It took me a long time, many years of taking regular weekly Feldenkrais classes and Bartenia fundamentals classes to get over the idea that I didn't need the teacher to cue every single thing I was doing, every little tiny movement. So, like for example, when we were lying on our backs in the X and I said, slide your right elbow to your right knee, and that's it, right? Instead of saying a whole bunch of other things, like that's the only cue. And that's all that's needed. Or saying, like, what would happen if, as you slide your right elbow to your right knee, you notice, the sensation in the right side of your waist? So it's a question. And I think the more I took classes where the cues were inquiry based, the easier it was for me to add those cues into my teaching. Okay. Share screen. So consider how you might be able to include more questioning or promote more curiosity in your classes to help your students explore movement with less judgment or rigidity. And in a lot of those pre-recorded sequences, I would cue with a question of, say, if you're lifting really high, what would happen if you lifted less high or lower? Or if you are turning a lot when you rotate, what would happen if you turn less? And so, or if when you lift, you're using your arm to push into the floor, what happens when you don't? And which one do you like better? So the questions invite your students to try things in different ways and make decisions for themselves. Okay, so that actually takes us all the way through the PowerPoint lecture. And I'm thinking, we could do one of two things. Let me know, Dana, what you think. Should I go right into the movement class, or should I answer some of the questions that I didn't get to from the last time?
I can read some of the questions from the last time if you want to use the next 15 minutes to do that, and then we can move to movement.
Yeah, I am totally fine with either way. I just figured I'd ask.
Yeah, I think we might as well use the time to answer some of those.
Perfect. Yes. Okay. There's two when I open it. The ones that I see are, the first one, it says sensing lots of resonance with yin yoga.
So those
I just have two.
So Trina, those are the ones that are were added just for this session. I have the questions that were left over from earlier today.
Okay, perfect.
So let me read the first one here.
Okay.
Who was the teacher referenced at the end of yesterday's session for exploring play in movement on YI?
Yes, that is Carrie Owerko. First name is Carrie, Carrie, and last name is Owerko, Owerko. She's great.
And I also added it to the chat.
She's a dear friend, and I just absolutely love her teaching style.
Okay, next question. Even though I teach a lot of these practices myself, drawing mostly from Access syllabus, I really appreciate your precise methodology and the materials you've shared. It's great to see how you think. Do you start with anatomical/biomechanical principles, or with how something feels in your body when sequencing somatics in yoga vocabulary?
Let's see, when sequencing. Well, first of all, I've always wanted to study with Trey Faust, so I think that's awesome that you've gotten to do that. It's on my list from Access Syllabus. And yeah, when I sequence a group class for group classes, I tend to pick a theme that's related, probably more around. Not that I always do this, but I do tend to do this more, biomechanical principles or a movement skill. And that could be anything from, and I'll get into this a lot more in the very last session, which is called putting it all together and how to sequence. But, it could be something as simple as like the theme is spinal flexion. And of course, we're not going to do like a whole hour of spinal flexion, but that might be what we are exploring. And so I pick yoga poses and somatic movements that illuminate spinal flexion. But it could also be like a peak pose, yoga pose, and then like what somatic movements or sequences would help people to better understand that pose. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, I definitely pick things that I think feel good in my own body for sure. But then there's also the educational element that I like to include as well.
Okay, next one. Pull it up. Love the last flow. Do you have a flow guide, recommended sequence guide that you have?
Gosh, I don't. I just like to study with and take classes from teachers that are really good at flow because I am not, but I love the way it feels and I love taking those classes. And it's really interesting. I actually haven't started teaching flow until the pandemic because during the pandemic, I teach online, and I can, full disclosure, tape sticky notes with up on the wall, and it's enabled me to be able to teach flow. When I taught in person, my regular classes, I still always had a sheet of paper with my class syllabus that I would look at, but I wasn't teaching flow. You know, I mean, it would flow together, but it wasn't like a flow because I needed to look at the piece of paper throughout the class. So I learn by 3 steps. The first step is imitate. So if there's a flow that I like that a teacher teaches, I take the class. I learned this in my 200-hour. She would say, go take a class, sit in your car after class, take out your notebook, and try to write down everything you remember, which of course you don't remember everything. Those are the days before there were like, you know, your teachers that you took classes with teaching online. And then as like a couple days with, I forgot that part, write it in. And then, you know, I would practice that person's flow, try to teach that person's flow. And then I would sub things out and switch things out and make it different based on whatever movement skill I wanted to teach. So yeah, I just call it imitate, integrate, innovate. So first you pick something you like and you just try to teach that thing. Then once you've taught that thing and you feel like you got it, then you start to integrate some of your own stuff into it. And then, you know, when you hit that mastery level, which I am not when it comes to teaching flow, I am maybe with other things, you are completely coming up with the flow on your own. So I hope that's helpful. I remember when I finished my 200-hour, I went to the library, and it was 2007 or 8, and we didn't really learn how to teach flow, and I wanted to teach it. So I got Cindy Lee's book, and she had stick figure flows in the back of her book, and I photocopied them at the library and, you know, taught those for a while. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. And then I'm recommending people. So like today's class was inspired by Kylie, who has classes on YI. Yesterday's class, there's another class I taught on YI that you can reference. It's similar but different, and actually inspired by my friend Laurel Beaversdorf. So yeah, I don't have any like specific protocols or formulas that I use.
Okay, next one is, what is the name of the TED Talk speaker referenced? Must have been earlier.
Yes.
Today. Why
Yes.
Things Hurt. Yeah.
So if you go to YouTube and you search Why Things Hurt, Lorimer Moseley, it'll pop up. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, and we'll try to find it and pop it into the
chat. I thought I put that link in the chat box, but let me do it. I'll pull it up and put it in there again because I have it right here in my notes. And you know what? I have. Let me do this real quick. Oops. Let's see if I can get all of this to highlight. There we go. Command C. And I'm going to go close and then back to here. Okay, chat box. And I'm going to paste. All right, there's a whole bunch of resources that I put in my notes. Todd Hargrove's book, Greg Lehman's. I think I shared most of these already, but here they are all again. I haven't talked yet about that osteoporosis weightlifting research, but highly recommend those videos as well. Okay.
I think we have 2 more. Let me go find them.
Okay.
Can you point the way to a good reference that explains the pulling in versus poofing out in order to stabilize the core?
Yes. Okay. Oh gosh, let me think of her name. Tracy. Okay, let me do, you know, where it's like tip of your tongue. It's a YouTube thing. You know what? I think I don't want to take time searching for it right now, But if somebody can like just send me an email as a thing to do, I'll just find it later. And because I have a feeling my brain just isn't going to find it right now, and it'll take up too much time, but I'll find it later. But yeah, long of short of it, as I would say, bracing versus hollowing. If you search bracing, BRACING, versus hollowing, HOLLOWING, there's a ton of research on why you would do one versus the other. The Reader's Digest on that is, of course, it depends. Hollowing is for low loads and low level activities, and often described as unnecessary because the research is from the 90s. Bracing is recommended when you're lifting really heavy weights. You consciously do it, but high level athletes do it automatically. So yeah. And then there's like a video, really nice video about intra-abdominal pressure with a physical therapist. And she has a balloon, and that's the one I'm trying to think of, but I can't remember her name at the moment. I can't remember the name of the video. So I'll get that for you later. But I think it is kind of like that TED Talk with Laura Mosley, where she explains a lot in a really, smart way, simply. Okay.
Okay, one more, and then I think we're caught up from this morning. Is there a somatics toolkit that I can use when teaching yoga? Example, I want to teach a particular asana and want to start with a somatic sequence to support it, or a student is having trouble with a particular asana.
Yes. So that is what this course is all about. But it's one of those things where I really hate when teachers say, trust the process. I don't like that line. But what it is saying is like, yeah, that's what we're getting to. So the very last session of this weekend is going to be all about that. A lot of you might have picked up on that already, but I'm going to like literally spell it out in the last session. With the pre-recorded sequences. My book is the same way. It's like plug and play. So I will teach you how to imitate so that you can integrate and then innovate. But the long and short of it is, for example, yesterday, we did a somatic sequence that involved a lot of rotation. And so I would teach poses that involve rotation, twists. Earlier today, I taught a sequence that was all about what's happening in the coronal plane. Some people call that the frontal plane. And thus we did a lot of poses that happen in the frontal coronal plane, in external rotation and abduction. So it really comes down to plane of movement and direction of movement at the joint. So this afternoon, right, we're gonna do back bends. So I'm gonna teach you a somatic sequence that I think is really helpful for back bends. Back bends are sagittal plane movement. The direction of movement of the spine is extension. And so that's how I like to conceive of sort of the formula, so to speak.
Okay, and we are all caught up from this morning's questions. So if you want to move into the movement practice, and then we'll go from there.
Perfect. All right. Let's see. So let me pull out, I'm going to put this away. And so I'm going to pull out this just as a reminder to myself, but in the sequencing guide, the pre-recorded sequences that you got ahead of time, we're doing, it's called back bending with somatics. And as you can see here, there's sequence 1, and I call that the prone salutes sequence. It's also in the back of that Thomas Hanna somatics book with little stick figure drawings, like I showed you. And then sequence 2 is a Bartinieff fundamental sequence. So it's another X roll. It's upper body initiated, but we go from prone, we go from the belly to the back. So there's a lot of extension happening in the spine. And so that's why I picked these two sequences to go with a backbending asana class. We're doing prone salutes, but you could just as easily teach a backbend class and do sequence 2 with the X roll as like a plug and play type of thing. Side note, when I teach backbends, I often find the best warm-up is thoracic rotation. So while I picked sequences here that are spinal extension or extension with rotation, I would also teach a backbending class using a somatic sequence that's just rotation. So say like the palm slides from yesterday or the X rolls that involved rotation. It really depends on the person. Some people, it's helpful for them to do thoracic rotation before backbends. Others, it's better to do small backbends before big backbends. Combination of the two, we're all different. So know that there's not a right or wrong for groups because everyone's different. But with your personal private clients, you'll see patterns. I have different clients who respond better to one versus the other because their bodies are different. So that's kind of a little heads up overview on the pre-recorded sequence. And then the class outline for today, this one is called Find the Why in Your Wheel Pose. And so the last class was like a very sort of Shiva-Ray flowy type of class. This class is inspired by FRC, which stands for Functional Range Conditioning. And I took that training, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it's a lot of mobility drills where you create global tension like you would when you're lifting weights to find strength and motor control in your end ranges of motion. When I took the training, I was like, oh, thank God, this is amazing. Andrea Spina, who is the creator of FRC, is finally making Pilates cool for the bro dudes at the gym because Pilates has such a feminine energy about it. It's all the marketing is towards women, but Joseph Pilates called his work contrology. He did not call it Pilates. It wasn't called Pilates till after he died. He called his work contrology, which simply means controlling your ranges of motion, which is the premise of FRC. And, you know, FRC doesn't require any of the Pilates apparatus equipment, so it's very accessible. And as a Pilates teacher, I definitely, you know, resonated with the FRC and especially how I could use it to enhance my yoga students' understanding of asana. So shout out to Cecily Milne. She teaches what she calls Yoga Detour, and she is brilliant at incorporating FRC into yoga. So I've learned a ton from taking online classes with her, and this is inspired by a class I took with her.